Hello and welcome to Tank Talk, the only podcast serving the global bulk liquid storage industry and hosted by leading publication Tank Storage Magazine. I'm your host Anamika, and today I'm speaking with Hayley Armstrong, a partner at consulting firm AJW Inc. Hayley and I will be exploring the carbon border adjustment mechanism and how it impacts storage terminals and, more importantly, your clients. So let's get into it.
If we want to just start with what the CBAM actually is, as we mentioned, it came into force earlier this year. So can you just tell us a bit about, who's impacted and what they might need to do?
Yeah, sure. So the CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, it's a carbon price attached to certain carbon sensitive goods that are imported into the EU. So the actual importers themselves are the ones that are responsible for paying for those embedded emissions. And the price, which I can get more into this if you're interested, the price is really tied to the EU ETS price at that time. On any given week, it's attached to that average ETS price. It's not an import tax, and it's not applied to every import. It's just applied initially to about 5 or 6 different product categories with very specific product codes. And over time, it will touch more and more sectors between now and 2030. There's talk that they'll have every EU ETS product covered by 2030, but we expect for that to be kind of phased in depending on different emissions factors and priorities for the EU. And then by 2034, we'll have full implementation. There will be no more free allowances, which are kind of, I guess you could call them discounts under the ETS for any industry. So it'll be full-fledged, full emissions responsibility paid at the border by importers by 2034. So you can just look at the next, I guess, 8 years or so as, it's implemented, it's going, you're responsible for the duties. I guess duties sounds more like a tax. You're responsible for the price of the carbon. Starting now. So it's arguably the most significant climate policy since the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016. So it's going to be very important to prepare and understand how your business is impacted.
Mm-hmm. And you were quite careful there to not call it a tax, right? But I think that most of our listeners are probably thinking it is a tax, it is a carbon tax. Can you kind of assure them or reassure them, what is the difference between this carbon pricing and, just an additional tax for importers to pay?
Yeah, I think there's some nuance when it comes to like how the EU is going to be using the money. They're not going to be using it for, just the general coffers of the EU. There's some bonds and some loans that need to be paid back from COVID that I think that some of these funds are going to be specifically used initially to pay back. And then there's talk about funding specific climate programs, both in the EU and in third countries. So I think that the nuance is really on like how the funding is used, from what I understand. And it's very specifically based on a fluctuating price. So I think, from a tax perspective, that would be quite complicated. But if you look at it as more of a fee that is tied to another price, then that just becomes a little bit more simplified and adds for that flexibility in how that's calculated.
Okay. And what are the initial goods groups that are being impacted by the CBAM right now?
Yeah, so to start, I'll start with the ones that I think terminals and tank storage would be most impacted by. So those would be fertilizers and hydrogen. I know hydrogen's really an emerging market, but as we enter the next decade plus of this program being in place, there will be specific implementation requirements for that product category. Other categories that are in place now are cement, iron and steel, aluminum, and electricity. Electricity is kind of complicated and has its whole own set of rules. So the other categories are really just the kind of like the bread and butter of the CBAM.
And as you mentioned, the storage terminals are going to be probably most interested in how it's going to impact fertilizers and the emerging market of hydrogen. So how is this going to impact terminals themselves and the tank farm owners and the operators? Or is it really just an extra fee for their customers to be paying?
So it does impact terminals. It impacts really every piece of the supply chain, the value chain. Just take fertilizer, for example. If you have fertilizer that's imported into a terminal that's then is going to be distributed across the EU, the terminal is really responsible for being part of that chain of custody. So you're a data collection point. You need to be very organized in terms of being CBAM ready for your customers. You really are there to ideally reduce friction points for the importer and for um, your customers. If you have really clear classifications, traceability, high quality data, that becomes a good selling point for those that are importing through your terminal. Yes, the market outside of you will change. You may have more or less fertilizer coming in depending on pricing, or it may just come from a different place, or like the sourcing may be different, but your job really is going to be controlling that information and making it easily accessible. If that information is not clear and not organized properly, there can be significant delays at the EU border as those checks are happening to make sure that there's compliance.
And so what should a liquid bulk terminal be doing to prepare for CBAM and making sure that they can help with that compliance?
I think it's just more investment in OpEx. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of CapEx responsibility on terminals. Maybe, we'll see how this rolls out over the next 10 years. But in the near term, I think OpEx investments in, organization, having a consultant come in and make sure that you are ready to have all of this documentation prepared. One kind of like physical change that you might want to consider, and you'd want to talk to your customers about this, would be, do you need to make sure that like the batches of their products are completely separated from other products? Can there be commingling, for example? So that would be questions to ask in terms of like actual physical changes at the tank farm. But otherwise, I think it's just being organized, maybe creating like a CBAM prep pack and having that ready to fill out, having that ready for your customers, and just offering like the highest assurance possible that your traceability, your documentation is prepared and clean, and you can maybe even help to advise on what do your customers need to have ready to go.
I mean, what you mentioned there about, having to have potentially separate storage tanks and separate pipelines for a customer's product. I mean, that is going to be, a huge change for some terminals potentially. With the CBAM already being in place, are we seeing any kind of bottlenecks, or are there any kind of major issues that maybe you've seen out in the field in the last 20 days or so?
I think it's too soon to tell, but there are there's a number of EU policies that don't really think about the impact necessarily initially on how that works in practice. One example, which is not the CBAM, is the union database for gas on the grid in the EU. So there's specific requirements that if you're going to be using biomethane in the EU and you want it to be used to comply with regulations, it has to be produced in the EU and run through EU pipelines. But in reality, that's not always how it works. And a lot of the product is imported and doesn't actually enter the grid immediately through a pipeline. So things like that, I think we're going to see as this really rolls out. So to be determined, and especially as more ETS sectors are added, we could have more refinery products added, different petroleum products. There's talk about adding organic chemicals, basic chemicals by 2030. So I think, fertilizer and hydrogen are like step one, and we can use those as kind of a testing ground to see like is this workable? What do we need to do in terms of actual infrastructure changes? And then hopefully by the time that there's more volume with some of these refined products, that's a bit more clear answer.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk, especially in the last couple of months, about Europe's chemical industry, and the rather sorry state of it.
Mm-hmm.
It feels to me, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me like the CBAM is potentially going to be an additional barrier to the thriving chemical industry in the EU and, in the UK as well. I
Yeah.
mean, what's your thought on that?
I think, there's different ways of looking at this. One is that this policy in its foundation is meant to protect EU industries. It's meant to stop carbon leakage. It's meant to level the playing field and create more opportunity for European industry. As countries like the UK establish their own CBAMs, and I know like Norway is looking at their own, and other jurisdictions, the reason is to really just ramp up domestic production. And if you're going to be importing other products, then those products should be also facing similar compliance costs for low emissions. So theoretically, it should be helping the EU chemical sector. But if we're looking at, if they're importing certain products to develop those chemicals, there may be higher costs associated. But over time, I think the intent is to make things a bit more level. It really will impact most kind of the emerging markets and countries where putting in the infrastructure for data collection, emissions reduction technologies, emissions measurement and verification, like that's very costly. So countries in Africa or Southeast Asia, for example, that are importing into the EU, some of these feedstocks and things that feed into like chemicals, for example, or iron and steel, those countries will be most impacted because it's going to be very hard for them to comply economically.
Okay, fine. So I suppose there's sort of terminals being a part of that chain and kind of being a very set data point. The terminals in the EU almost already have a lot of that data in place and ways to collect that data. Am I right there?
I would think they do, yeah. And so it's just going to become more important and can be used as a marketing piece, especially for countries where, or if the exporting country doesn't have that capacity or capability, you can help them with that.
Right. And then I suppose for anyone who's importing, as you say, then from Southeast Asia or from Africa and from countries where the markets are still developing, what could those terminals, what potentially should those terminals be doing to prep for CBAM? I mean, it seems like it might be quite costly for them to actually continue exporting.
I think it's a similar process. Like they also have to be ready to go as a piece of the value chain. I've even heard that the EU, at least initially, for some of the verifications for compliance, they're looking for in-person checks to make sure that there's compliance along the full value chain. No idea how that's going to actually happen and roll out in a time or cost efficient way. But yeah, so like, if you're a terminal that's, on the exporting side and say, I don't know, just somewhere in Africa, then you also have to have all the same compliance requirements as the EU because as the EU terminal because you're going to be responsible for passing along that information or making sure that it's tied to the right molecule or the right batch of fertilizer. If that gets mixed up, you're looking at major delays or huge fines or prices under the CBAM.
Yeah.
So it's going to be really important.
That sounds like the kind of job that I would really, I volunteer, honestly. If you want me to go all around the world and check terminals, I'll do that.
Yeah, I saw something that was like 30 or 40,000 sites are going to have to be verified or something
Wow.
crazy like that. And so yeah, I'd messaged my colleague and I was like, this looks like a new a new area that we need to start consulting in.
Yeah.
So yeah, the big market ahead for somebody. And just as a piece of the puzzle and all of this, I think terminals can just the sooner you get organized and get prepared and start thinking about this, the better, or else you might face delays, which might make you less attractive for those exports.
Mm, definitely. And I want to touch a little bit on what you mentioned earlier, which is there seems to be some kind of indications as to what additional goods might fall into CBAM later on. Do you think there might be any, well, first, what are those? What does it look like is going to come into CBAM? And also, do you think there might be any kind of exemptions, potentially for sort of mission critical goods?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's over 180 products under consideration to be added. If you look at the EU ETS and all the sectors covered and like subsectors beneath, it's pretty expansive. So that gives you a good insight into like what will likely be covered to just look at the ETS sectors. But priority number one are going to be products that have iron and steel and aluminum embedded in them. So that doesn't necessarily touch terminals too much. It would touch them, I suppose, if you're looking to, build new infrastructure at your site or, just kind of more capital things that are not really related to trade. But then beyond those products, the next category would be what I was mentioning earlier, like chemicals, refined products, um, industrial gases, plastics. Those are the types of things that are going to be a bit more complicated to implement and add to the CBAM, but they are likely and, at this point, there's no reason that they wouldn't be added. It's just, it needs to be formally agreed upon and legislatively added to the CBAM implementation policy. In terms of exemptions or delays, I've heard there might be talk of some sort of consideration around fertilizers. Particularly, I think you had mentioned like the chemical sector is kind of struggling in the EU. Likewise, I've heard things about the fertilizer segment in the EU and like competition from Russia. Apparently, they've been kind of flooding the fertilizer market in response to not really being able to access the same natural gas markets. So they've shifted some of their priority exports to the fertilizer market and have kind of driven costs in certain ways. Not really my area of expertise, but just kind of heard that through the grapevine. So I think that the EU is really trying to find ways to make sure that there's ample supply of fertilizer, give the fertilizer industry time to kind of balance out, given that structural change on a global level. So that's maybe more of a temporary policy kind of leeway. Nothing has happened yet, but that's kind of something to like watch this space kind of thing to see if something happens. Otherwise, I mean, the EU has really stuck to their guns on this policy. Um, the US, for example, has tried to negotiate exemptions or relief or, give us some free allowances or exempt us completely, but so far, no luck. So, I think that the plan is to move forward, and we have countries that are going to the World Trade Organization, the WTO, formally complaining, but realistically, the WTO hasn't done anything significant in 20 or 30 years. So the likelihood of actual success um, is unlikely. So I think the biggest thing to watch will be probably President Trump. I mean, he's the most willing to risk trade negotiations and really come in heavy-handed to try to get his way, so to speak. And so, if the US can't carve out some sort of deal, I don't see anybody being able to. And I don't really see any sectors being able to unless those sectors in the EU really call for that and have a great justification to say we need some time or, whatever that may be.
Okay, so it is really a lot about then encouraging, as you said earlier, encouraging production to come back to the EU then.
Yeah, and just making it more fair. I mean,
Mm.
EU producers will still be responsible for complying with the ETS, which will have the exact same price as the CBAM, but you won't have the transportation costs if you produce in Europe. You may have higher production costs. So it balances it out. It's just I think that the EU wants all the products to be the same price to the extent that they can, so that the EU producers are more competitive and can actually, sustain pricing and, make sure that jobs stay here. Maybe they're not added, but they're not losing industry.
Okay. I mean, a big part of me wants to ask something about President Trump, but I think also we could have this conversation right now, and by the time this actually goes out, something else will have happened. So
Yeah. I mean, yesterday, so we're recording this in mid to late January.
yeah.
Yesterday, um, President, the start of the day, it looked like all the US EU trade negotiations were just gonna fall through. The EU was pushing back on this whole Greenland, I don't even know what you want to call it, quest. And then by the end of the day, Trump had backed down and all's good, no tariffs. So yeah, we can try to predict the future and read the tea leaves, but that's probably the hardest part of my job right now is predicting what might happen under Trump. So yeah, I think a good case study is, like I said, last summer, the US tried to negotiate and has not had any success in moving the needle on the CBAM, at least.
I am going to ask you now to look into your crystal ball a little bit, though, because CBAM is very much a European thing. So, what do you think it might imply? Because I know we mentioned the UK, we've mentioned Norway, so these are non-EU countries. What does that imply in terms of further policy and regulations for other countries, other regions, even?
Yeah, so the CBAM, as I said at the beginning, is arguably the most important climate policy since the Paris Climate Agreement,
Mm-hmm.
because other countries that are importing into the EU want to protect their own industries. So the UK ETS, or sorry, the UK CBAM and their ETS is really meant to just maintain alignment with the EU. So that's kind of a different situation. There's a lot of trade happening between the two jurisdictions. Similar with Norway. Norway is part of the EEA. So anything that's kind of local to the EU, those are just kind of like, we need to just make sure everything keeps moving as possible and trade doesn't blow up. In places like China that exports quite a bit to the EU, they have such an active and substantial internal domestic market for all of their products that the EU is just like one of many markets that they're exporting to. And as I said, they're using their products internally. They have the US, they have Brazil, Australia. So I don't think China's super, super concerned about it. However, they have modified their own Chinese ETS to include all of the segments that are covered under the CBAM. So that means that with the way that the CBAM is structured, when you import a product from a country that has a carbon price, like an ETS, you can subtract that carbon price from your CBAM price. So say you are responsible for paying, just very simply, 100 euros when you import product X. If you manufactured or produced that product in China and say the ETS price in China is equivalent to 20 euros, you can then subtract that 20 euros from the 100 euros that's due at the border in the EU. So the purpose of that is that China can then keep their carbon price. They can keep the money themselves. Otherwise, you're just giving all of the money that's embedded in the emissions to another country. So countries like China, like Japan, I think I have a whole list of them I can send you. They're all looking to see, well, like, hey, we want to keep the money ourselves. So let's set up an ETS that's more robust, that covers all of these markets, so that rather than the EU collecting that fee, we can at least get a little piece of the pie ourselves. So we're seeing that happen in jurisdictions that have an ETS or are setting up an ETS, that they want to align their product categories with the CBAM. It's also initiated conversations in the US about like, maybe we should set up some sort of carbon border fee. I don't think that we'll see a price on carbon in the US probably for like the next, I don't know, 8+ years, realistically. Um, but they are inspired to protect their border, particularly from China. So yeah, all that to say, long-winded answer. It's initiated a lot of policy discussion globally, and the goal is that it will hopefully reduce emissions around the world. But every country is going to try to find a way to keep that money for themselves.
Which, makes sense. We don't all have to, well, you don't all want to pay the EU, right? I can
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
that.
exactly. Yeah, and they're also going to be looking for ways to make their exporting companies, easier compliance. Like they'll be helping to negotiate terms and things like that. And in places like the US, it's kind of a tricky situation right now because if you're exporting to the EU, you have to have all this information, all this data that's collected in a very like specific way
Mm.
um, in order to actually participate in the market. And they're the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has proposed to repeal all GHG reporting. So a
Ah,
lot of companies are like, we still have to do it, like it doesn't really change anything because we still
mm,
need to, if we're going to be exporting to the EU or anywhere that's setting up a CBAM, like we need this information anyway. So,
mm.
um, yeah, it's kind of just an interesting time in the like carbon verification and monitoring world.
Yeah. It's also interesting how much a policy from a different region, economic region, can impact you domestically, in the US, like you say, just because your regulations are being scaled back a little bit, or the reporting side of it at least, doesn't mean that you can stop reporting because you still have to in order to export your goods.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, even in the US, I know we're talking about the CBAM, but even in the US, you have to think about and prepare for reporting requirements in places like California. Like they're going to be
Mm,
requiring like, I think it's scope 1 and 3, maybe, or I can't remember, but they're requiring reporting. So you're best to just keep doing it. Like if you're doing it already, don't lose that capacity, don't lose the information, just keep going. And you, as I said earlier about like terminals setting themselves up as great data collection points, and you offer this great ability to be organized. Same thing goes for just GHG data reporting and collection in general. You can offer that if you're you know a natural gas company. If
mhm.
you can say like, hey, we've got like all these certificates ready to go, we're CBAM ready or California compliance ready, like that's a good marketing plan, and kind of sets you apart from somebody who just pushes it to the wayside.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners who are the tank farm owners and operators and the terminal owners and operators?
I'd just say prepare, be ready to answer questions, and ask for help. I mean, it's complicated. Um, Ask what your competitors are doing, go reach out to the EU. If you got a problem, tell them. So I
Mm,
think it's just like be proactive. Don't sit back and wait. I don't think people are. I think, everybody knows about this and it's happening now. But
mhm,
it's just going to become more and more stringent, more and more product categories are going to get added. So if you think like this doesn't really touch me, we don't deal with fertilizer, we don't have hydrogen, well, get ready because you probably will have products in the coming years that will be impacted. So get organized. That's all I would, that's the main thing. And, just, help your customers and be a
mhm.
resource.
Yeah, it's the thing that'll set you apart at the end of the day.
Yeah, hopefully, and it'll be an interesting policy to watch unfold. it's, it's not static, it's constantly changing. As I said, they haven't even officially decided to add all these product categories. So get engaged, I'm sure through trade associations, there's opportunities to advocate in Brussels and in your member states, if you're in the EU. So, just pay attention to it because it's impacting your customers.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much, Hayley. That was really insightful and really informative for me too. I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure that our listeners have as well.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. Anybody who has any questions, feel free to reach out. My name's Hayley Armstrong. You can find me on LinkedIn, and the CBAM is complicated. I'm learning every day, so happy to help out anybody. And we're all in this together to try to make sure it works. So thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll drop your details in the description as well for this.
Fantastic. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Tank Talk. Follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and even TikTok for regular updates. Subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts for the next edition of Tank Talk. And you can sign up to our free weekly newsletter at www.tankstorage.com. That's www.tankstorage.com. See you next time.